Hello. Today we're going to talk about something called implicit bias. It's not just a buzzword, so let's begin. So I'm sure by now you've probably heard about this thing called implicit bias, but what exactly is it? Well, in order to fully understand what implicit bias is, we need to back up a little bit and talk about something called cognitive science. Cognitive science is just a fancy phrase for how our brains work and process information. Our brains are like a computer. From the time of our birth, our brains are processing thousands, if not millions of stimuli each day, from what you see to what you smell, taste, and touch. In order for our brains to process and make sense of everything, our brains make connections with all the stimuli, and this allows for faster processing inside our brains. Think of all the things you can do on a daily basis that require little or no effort. Like driving. When you were first learning to drive, every step from unlocking the car to putting on your seatbelt and using turn signals was very methodical and intentional. But now, driving is probably second nature to most of us. Think about the first time you learned a new skill, like inserting a urinary catheter. First, you need to learn the human anatomy. Second, you needed to learn sterile technique. And third, you actually learned how to insert the catheter. Well, now let's fast forward and you're working in the ED for a few years. That process of inserting a catheter becomes very automatic and fast, and you may even take a few shortcuts to speed up the process. Now enter implicit bias. We've all heard the phrase, you are what you eat. But you are also everything you hear and see and learn. The definition of implicit bias, also called unconscious bias, is when you make spontaneous judgments about people or situations based on your past experiences, culture, background, or exposure to the media. These spontaneous judgments stem from our brain's meager attempt at mental shortcuts and decision-making for faster information processing from the bombardment of thousands of messages it receives each second. Implicit bias is a flaw in the automatic processing of our brains. A flaw in the connections which lead to stereotypes. Think of all the times you've heard stereotypes such as Asians are good at math, Indians are great with computers, Black people are good at sports, or all the stigma and negative connotations around tattoos and piercings. We all do this. No one is exempt. Our brains are consistently trying to work more efficiently by making unconscious associations that affect our understanding and could influence our actions and decisions, which can also be at odds with our own intentions or explicit values. Implicit bias does not make us bad people, but we must recognize and understand that this unconscious brain processing is often flawed despite our best efforts at trying to be perfect. Scientists and researchers have identified over 200 cognitive biases. There's a great interactive on Wikipedia called the Cognitive Bias Codex, which explains all the cognitive biases that have been identified. Okay, let's be honest. How many of you just cringed when I said Wikipedia? I know. Not the best place for scholarly info, but check it out. I promise, it's really good and factually accurate. But I digress. Let me talk about a couple of examples of implicit bias really quick. For example, confirmation bias. The tendency of a person to seek out information that supports something they already believe. People will focus on the information that matters most to them and dismiss the things that don't, thereby avoiding information that may disprove their original point. For example, an unvaccinated person with flu-like symptoms tells their family or work that they have a bad cold instead of the flu or COVID. Another example is anchoring bias. The tendency to be overly influenced or rely too heavily on the first piece of information that we hear, or anchor on this piece of fact to base all subsequent judgments or opinions. For example, paying too much attention to one part of an assessment or patient's history and overlooking other assessment data or some clinical manifestations because they don't correlate to other findings like the original diagnosis. One of my favorites is availability bias, which comes into play when also making decisions. The individual will rely on information that they can quickly recall, even if this information is not applicable in the given situation. Using this mental shortcut, the information we can most easily recall as valid and ignore alternative solutions or opinions. For example, One watches one news channel continuously and trusts that the information presented is factual and without bias. Or the belief that breast cancer is more prevalent in society because everyone in your family had breast cancer. So why does all this matter? Well, implicit bias is very prevalent in healthcare, unfortunately. The literature is very clear. Nurses with implicit bias, 1, show less compassion for certain patients, 2, invest less time and effort in patient care, 3, dedicate less time to building therapeutic relationships, and 4, adversely impact assessment and outcomes, leading to inappropriate diagnoses and treatment decisions. The consequences of implicit bias in healthcare lead to unequal treatment and unequal outcomes. For example, studies have found that when students enter medical and nursing school, they harbor implicit biases towards minority patients, and their level of bias remains constant or increases over time. Another study found that white medical students and residents, half of them endorsed beliefs about biological differences between Black people and white people, viewing Black patients' pain as lower than white patients, leading to less accurate treatment recommendations for Black patients. Last example, implicit biases in healthcare professionals towards Black people, especially Black women, are a contributing factor for racial and ethnic disparities in adverse maternal and child health outcomes, and affect rates of racial and ethnic disparities in contraceptive use, access to and quality of prenatal care, and clinical decision-making in the interpartum, and postpartum periods. At this point, you're probably wondering, if implicit bias is truly unconscious, well, how can we change it? Well, great question. You can't change something you can't see. Here are a few strategies to control for or mitigate bias in your own life or practice. 1, educate yourself by looking inward. The next time you feel some type of way about a person or a group of people, I want you to ask yourself, why do I feel this way, or why do I think this way? The more we start to bring the conscious to the front of our minds, then we can submit those unconscious thoughts to our conscious control or conscious will, and then we can change them. When we fail to learn about our blind spots, we miss opportunities to avoid harm. Educating ourselves about the unconscious processes that affect our clinical decisions is the first step. 2, exposure. It is also helpful to expose ourselves to counter stereotypes and to focus on the unique individuals we interact with on a daily basis. Gaining exposure to other groups and ways of thinking can mitigate bias. Does your immediate circle of friends all look like you? Well, I encourage you to reach out and interact with those who may not look like you and get to learn more about them, their likes, their dislikes, their customs, and their culture. By doing this, I guarantee you a couple of things will happen. 1, you'll learn something you didn't already know about the person or group or culture. Or 2, it will challenge you to reconsider these false thoughts, images, or ideologies that have been cemented into your memory. How do you increase exposure? Great question. Well, clinical groups or active learning activities within the classroom are great ways to start a dialogue and share thoughts and ideas or dispel common stereotypes. Nurses or other faculty can use the break room to spark dialogue with people you don't know much about. In order to be successful, though, dialogue requires vulnerability and an open mind. We don't know everything about everyone, and things we do know might in fact be false or wrong. And lastly, share what you've learned with others. We always tell our students, see one, do one, teach one, right? Well, the same applies to implicit bias. When we learn something new, share that information within your group of friends or family. When a stereotype comes up in conversation, I want you to educate them on the inaccuracy of that stereotype. Like any habit, it is difficult to change biased behaviors with a one-shot approach. So taking a systematic approach and incorporating a continuous process of improvement, practice, and reflection is critical to improving our mindset, our actions, and ultimately improving health equity. I really hope that you learned something of value today. And now that you know better, I want you to go out and do better. Until next time, bye-bye.